The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. It was the kind of evening when everything felt ordinary, when the usual sounds of children playing, cars passing, and the distant hum of the city blended together into a background rhythm. But that evening, something extraordinary was about to unfold, a moment that would change the lives of two families forever. On one side of town, a young child had wandered too far from home. The street was bustling, but it was one of those places where people are so caught up in their own worlds that they often don't notice what's happening right in front of them. The child, lost in a game, didn't see the car speeding down the road, its driver distracted, its brakes failing. Time seemed to slow as the vehicle rushed forward, headed straight for the child. Then, in the blink of an eye, something incredible happened. A man emerged from the crowd, moving faster than anyone could have expected. He didn't hesitate for a second. With sheer instinct, he lunged forward, grabbing the child just in time and pulling them to safety. The screech of tires, the blaring horn of the car, nothing mattered in that moment but the life that had just been saved. This was a story of heroism, of someone putting everything on the line for the safety of another. But what happened next? That's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The child's family, overcome with gratitude, rushed to thank the man who had saved their child's life. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have anticipated, was how their reaction would set the stage for something that would surprise everyone involved. The mix of emotions that filled the air, relief, disbelief, and something deeper, would spark a series of events none of them could have predicted. As the man stood there, his chest heaving with adrenaline, he couldn't have known that this act of bravery would cause ripples far beyond this one moment. The tension in the air grew thick, and the child's family, still processing what had just happened, were left with more questions than answers. Who was this man, really? Why did he do it? And how would they handle the unexpected twist that would follow? The man's life, the child's life, and the lives of their families were about to be tied together in ways that no one could have foreseen. But with that twist came an uncomfortable realization: not everyone was ready for what was about to unfold. The layers of this story were about to peel away, revealing things that no one expected. In the next part of this story, we'll dive deeper into the reactions that followed, the ones that would change the course of these families' lives. What will happen when gratitude and tension collide? What happens when the unexpected act of saving a life brings more than just thanks, but also challenges no one was ready for? Stay with me, because this is just the beginning. The minutes that followed the rescue were filled with chaos. The child, still shaken, was trembling in the arms of their parents, who had rushed forward the moment they saw what had happened. The man who had saved their life was standing off to the side now, his breathing slowing but his mind racing. He could feel their eyes on him, but he wasn't sure how to react. He had done what any person would do in that situation: he acted on instinct. But now, standing there in the aftermath, he was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake. The family's gratitude was immediate, but it was mixed with something else, something unspoken. The child's parents, still in shock, expressed their thanks in quick, nervous words, their voices shaking. But there was a tension in the air, a hesitation that couldn't be ignored. The father, a tall man with a stern face, shook the hero's hand, his grip firm, yet there was something in his eyes that suggested he was sizing the man up. The mother, visibly relieved but equally reserved, seemed lost in her own thoughts, her gaze flicking between her child and the man who had just saved them. As the family gathered their child into their arms, the man stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. He wanted to leave, to disappear back into the crowd and forget this moment ever happened. But something inside him told him that wasn't going to be possible. The look in the father's eyes told him that this wasn't over, that there was more to this encounter than just a simple act of heroism. The father was still processing, still trying to make sense of the situation, and he wasn't about to let it slide easily. "I don't know how to thank you," the mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've saved our child's life. We'll never be able to repay you for that." The man nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. But even as the gratitude hung in the air, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The family's reaction, while thankful, felt distant. There was a coldness beneath the surface. An uncertainty that made him question whether they saw him as a hero or something else. Did they feel indebted to him? Or did they feel threatened by the fact that he had stepped into their world, into their most intimate moment, and taken control in a way that none of them expected? The father broke the silence, his voice low but steady. I don't know what you're doing here, but you shouldn't be around our child. Not without some kind of explanation. The words hit harder than the man expected. He had been hoping for a more straightforward thank you, an acknowledgement of the good he had done. But instead, here was a warning, a line drawn in the sand. The father wasn't just thanking him, he was questioning him. And that question hung heavy between them. The man, caught off guard, tried to respond, but his words failed him. He had no answers for them, no explanation that would satisfy the tension that was building. He was just a guy who had happened to be in the right place at the right time. But standing there, with the weight of their stares pressing down on him, he realized that his mere presence was complicating things. This wasn't just about saving a life anymore, it was about something deeper, something that no one was ready to confront. The child, still clutched tightly in their mother's arms, looked up at the man, their wide eyes full of curiosity. They didn't fully understand what had just happened, but they felt the shift in the air, the unease that had replaced the initial relief. The man saw the child's gaze, and for a brief moment, he wondered if they could sense the unspoken question that hung between the adults. Why had he done it? What was his motive? The silence stretched on, the man's discomfort growing with every passing second. He knew he had to leave, to step away from the situation before things got more complicated. But just as he turned to walk away, the father's voice stopped him. Wait. The man paused, his heart racing. He turned slowly, almost afraid to face the growing tension. You didn't just happen to be there, the father said, his tone now sharp, his eyes narrowing. I've been watching you for a while. I know who you are. The words hit the man like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected this. How could the father know anything about him? He had never seen them before. And yet, here they were, acting as if they were familiar with him in ways he couldn't understand. The family's eyes seemed to widen at the father's words. The mother stepped forward, her hands still clutching the child tightly. What do you mean by that? She asked, her voice tinged with confusion and fear. What are you talking about? The father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the man, his gaze unwavering. You're not from around here, are you? You've been coming around this neighborhood for a while. I've seen you. The man's mind raced. What was he talking about? He had only been walking through the area to get to his job, nothing more, nothing less. But the father's accusation hung in the air, and the man realized that this was more than just an innocent misunderstanding. There was a deep mistrust there, something that ran far beyond the events of the day. The father's gaze softened for just a moment, but it didn't release the tension that was building between them. You need to leave. Now, he said, his voice low and final. The words echoed in the man's mind as he turned away and walked off. But even as he left, the unease stayed with him. What had just happened? Why had the father reacted that way? What was he hiding? And why had the child's family been so quick to turn their gratitude into suspicion? The man's mind was a swirl of unanswered questions as he walked away from the scene. He could still feel the weight of their stares, the questions that lingered in the air. He had saved their child's life. And yet, somehow, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the beginning of something much more complicated. What had begun as an act of simple bravery was turning into something far darker. The man knew he had to find out what was really going on. But with every step he took, he could feel the pull of something deeper, something dangerous, creeping up behind him. And the strangest thing? The deeper he dug into the mystery of that family, and their strange reaction, the more he realized that he wasn't the only one with a secret. Everyone had one. The man walked slowly through the quiet streets, his footsteps echoing on the pavement as the weight of what had just happened settled in. Every inch of him was still vibrating with the tension of the confrontation, the father's words still ringing in his ears. "I've been watching you." It wasn't just a warning, it felt like a challenge. The father knew something about him, about his life, something that he didn't understand. And the way the father had spoken to him, with such suspicion, suggested that this wasn't just about saving a child. This was personal. As he passed down the dimly lit street, the man's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Was he paranoid? Or was there more to the situation than he realized? There was something about the way the family had reacted, their hesitation, that didn't sit right with him. If they were truly grateful, why had they seemed so uncomfortable? Why had they treated him like a stranger, even though he was the one who had saved their child? The man had been living in this town for over a year now, working as a mechanic, staying out of the spotlight. He didn't know anyone, and no one really knew him. He kept to himself, focused on his job, trying to leave his past behind. He thought he had succeeded in blending in, but now it seemed like the family knew more about him than he had expected. And if they knew, who else did? The more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. What did the father mean when he said he had been watching him? It wasn't a casual remark, it was deliberate, pointed. As if the man was part of something bigger, something he had unwittingly stepped into. He had no history with the family, no connection to them. Or at least, that's what he thought. But the father's words made it clear that there was something under the surface, something buried that neither of them were ready to acknowledge. As he reached his apartment building, he found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone following him. The streets were empty, but the quiet was suffocating. He had always thought of this neighborhood as a place of safety, a place where he could leave behind the mess of his past life. But now, it felt different. Now, it felt like he was a part of something larger than himself, something that might not let him go as easily as he had hoped. Inside his apartment, the man tried to push the thoughts away. He sat down on the couch, trying to relax, but his mind kept racing. He had always been good at shutting things out. Years of living a life full of secrets had made him good at compartmentalizing. But now, everything felt connected. The father's strange behavior, the way the child had looked at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, and the unsettling sensation that he wasn't just an innocent bystander in this situation. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from his friend, a man he'd known for years, someone who had been there when he needed help in the past. The message was short, cryptic: "You need to be careful. They're looking for you." The words sent a chill down his spine. Who was looking for him? Why? He hadn't been involved in anything for a long time. His life was supposed to be behind him, he was just trying to make a living, stay under the radar. But now, it seemed like the past was catching up to him faster than he could outrun it. He quickly replied, asking for more information, but his friend didn't respond. The silence that followed made his anxiety flare. Was his friend warning him about the family? Or was it something else? Whoever was looking for him clearly knew about his past, and that was a problem. The man couldn't afford to be found. He stood up, pacing around the small room, trying to think. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The family's reaction was still haunting him. There had to be a reason for their wariness, for the father's harsh words. It couldn't just be about a random act of heroism. There had to be a deeper connection, one that he hadn't figured out yet. As the hours passed and the night stretched on, the man found it impossible to shake the feeling that something was coming for him. Something he couldn't control. The next morning, he decided to visit the family's house, hoping to clear the air. Maybe he was reading too much into it. Maybe he was just being paranoid, but he needed to know what they were hiding. He wasn't going to let it go. He had to find out what was really going on. When he arrived at the house, he hesitated at the front door. The place looked ordinary enough, quiet, well-kept, and suburban. The same house he had seen in passing when he first walked by the neighborhood. But today, it seemed more like a fortress, like something he wasn't meant to enter. He rang the doorbell, his heart thumping in his chest. After a moment, the door opened, and the mother stood there, her eyes wide with surprise. "I didn't expect you to come by," she said, her voice unsteady. "I need to talk," he replied, his tone firm. "About yesterday. About what your husband said." She stepped aside, allowing him in, but he could see the wariness in her eyes. Something had changed overnight, and she wasn't sure what to make of him. They sat down in the living room, the air thick with tension. The man was trying to find the right words, but every time he thought of a question, it felt like it wasn't enough. The mother stared at him, as though waiting for him to speak, but she was holding back too. He could tell that she wasn't ready to answer. "What did he mean?" he finally asked, his voice low. "When he said he'd been watching me?" She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her fingers twitched at her side, as though she wanted to reach for something, but she stopped herself. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "There's more at play here than you realize. You saved our child's life. But there are things that we can't explain to you right now. It's not just about you or us. It's about something bigger, something dangerous." The man leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the hallway, as though she was expecting someone to show up. Her eyes were full of fear now, and the man could sense that whatever was happening, it was beyond her control too. Before he could ask another question, the front door slammed open with a force that shook the house. The father stood in the doorway, his face hard and angry. "You need to leave," he said, his voice cold. "Now. Before you get yourself hurt." The words were a warning, not an invitation. The man's heart skipped a beat as the father stepped into the room, his gaze never leaving him. The family's house, which had seemed like a place of refuge just a moment ago, now felt like a trap. And the man realized that the real danger was only just beginning to unfold. The tension in the room was suffocating. The father's presence seemed to fill every corner, his cold eyes fixed on the man, daring him to challenge the warning. The mother stood up slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the child, pulling them protectively into her arms. The air was thick with unspoken words, and the silence was deafening. The man's mind was racing. The father's sudden appearance, the warning, the fear in the mother's eyes, it all felt like a puzzle he couldn't piece together. He had saved their child's life, hadn't he? Wasn't that enough? Why were they treating him like a threat? What was it about him that made them react this way? "Leave," the father repeated, his voice like ice, hard and unyielding. But the man couldn't just walk away. Not now, not when so many questions had been left unanswered. His pulse was pounding in his ears, his body on high alert as he tried to make sense of everything. He needed to know what was going on, what had brought this family to the brink of fear, what made them so afraid of him. He wasn't just some stranger, he had saved their child. That should have been enough to make them trust him. "What's really going on here?" the man asked, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. "Why are you acting like this? What are you hiding?" For a long moment, no one spoke. The father's gaze flickered briefly to his wife, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, with a sharp exhale, the father stepped closer, his stance tense and protective. "You don't understand," the father finally said, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "This isn't just about a stranger saving our child. It's about something much bigger, something we can't explain. Not now. Not like this." The man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, bigger? What's going on? Why is it so dangerous for me to be here?" The father's face twisted in a way that sent a chill down the man's spine. There was something about the way he said it, something that hinted at a past full of secrets and regret. The mother spoke up, her voice quieter than before but full of quiet desperation. "It's not just you. It's the whole town. They're watching. They've always been watching. And you." She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor as if she couldn't look him in the eye. "You're not who you say you are. There's more to you. More than we realized." The words hung in the air, unanswered, like a thread waiting to be pulled. The man felt his heart race, the knot in his stomach tightening. What was she implying? What could they possibly know about him? He was just a man, trying to live a quiet life, far away from the mess of his past. But every word she spoke, every fearful glance they exchanged, seemed to draw him deeper into a mystery he couldn't escape. Before he could respond, there was a loud crash from the hallway, followed by hurried footsteps. The father's face went white as he turned sharply toward the sound, and the mother's eyes widened with panic. "They're here," she whispered under her breath, a note of terror in her voice. The man's pulse quickened, his body instinctively tensing. He had no idea what they were talking about, but whatever it wasn't good. It felt like everything was coming apart at the seams, like the walls were closing in around him, and there was nowhere to run. The father moved quickly, his eyes never leaving the door, as he positioned himself in front of the mother and child. "You need to get out of here," he said urgently, his voice low and tight. "Now." The man's confusion grew. What was happening? Why were they so afraid? His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information. But before he could make sense of anything, the door burst open with such force that it nearly knocked the frame off its hinges. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light from outside. The man couldn't see their face, but the presence was undeniable, powerful, predatory, and far too familiar. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the silhouette, even before the figure stepped forward into the room. It was someone from his past. The blood drained from his face as the memory slammed into him like a tidal wave. A man he thought he had left behind. A man who knew everything about him. And the worst part? He had no idea why this person was here, why they had followed him, or how they had found him in the first place. But he could see the determination in their eyes, the look that said this encounter had been planned long ago. The father's posture shifted, his body going rigid with tension. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice trembling slightly now. "You weren't supposed to come back." The man took a step back, his mind racing. He didn't know who this person was, but whatever this was, whatever they had all been hiding, it was unraveling now, in front of him, and there was no way to stop it. The figure stepped fully into the room, and the light caught his face. The man's heart dropped. It was someone he thought he'd never see again. Someone who had been a part of his life long ago, someone whose actions had forced him to leave everything behind and start over in this quiet town. He had been running from this person for years, but now they were standing here, looking at him with cold, knowing eyes. "I knew you'd be here," the figure said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "I always knew. It was just a matter of time before you slipped up." The air seemed to freeze. The mother and father looked between the two men, their fear palpable, their eyes wide with terror. The child clutched the mother's side, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the danger that had suddenly become too real. The man opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His past, the very thing he had fought so hard to escape, had found him. And now, it was too late to run. The figure moved closer, his eyes never leaving the man. "You've made a mistake coming here," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "This town isn't what you think it is. It's never been what you think it is." The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in with every word. The man's mind reeled, trying to understand the full scope of the situation. But all he knew was that he was trapped, caught between his past and the family who had just brought him into their world, a world that was far darker than he had ever imagined. As the figure took another step forward, the father reached out, grabbing the man by the arm and pulling him back. "Run," the father whispered, his voice raw with desperation. "You don't want to be here when they—" But before he could finish, the figure laughed, the sound hollow and chilling. "It's already too late," he said, his grin widening. "The game has already started." And as the man stood there, helpless and uncertain, the tension in the room exploded. The clock was ticking, and whatever happened next would change everything. The room was thick with a palpable sense of dread, the tension so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on everyone. The figure who had appeared in the doorway was still smiling, that cold, predatory grin spreading across his face. His eyes glinted with something dark, something that made the man's skin crawl. The father's grip tightened on his arm, but there was no escape. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than he could process, and it was clear that whatever had brought this person back into his life was only the beginning. "You don't understand," the man whispered, his voice shaking as he tried to pull away from the father's grasp. "I didn't do anything. I'm not who you think I am." His heart was racing, the world around him feeling like it was closing in. The father's gaze held a mixture of regret and fear, and that was the last thing he needed right now. He needed answers, not more questions. The figure in front of him tilted his head, as if considering the man's words before he spoke again. "You never really did understand, did you?" His tone was almost mocking, like the man was a child who had no idea what was going on. "All these years, you thought you could run, thought you could hide. But there's no escaping this. There never was." The father's hand gripped tighter, his knuckles turning white. But then unexpectedly he released the man. The mother gasped, her eyes wide with terror, as if she had just seen something in the father's expression that terrified her. "No," the father said, his voice low, shaking. "You were supposed to be safe here. You shouldn't have come." The man looked from the father to the figure, trying to make sense of it all. The past he had tried so desperately to bury was clawing its way back to the surface, and he could feel the walls closing in on him once again. It wasn't just about the family anymore. It was about his entire life, the life he thought he had left behind. The figure smiled wider, his eyes gleaming. "You're really not the sharpest tool in the shed, are you?" He stepped closer, his footsteps slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "You thought you were just some nobody, living out your days as a mechanic in a quiet town. But the truth is you've always been part of something bigger. Something you can't escape." The man's chest tightened. His head spun with confusion, fear, and the crushing weight of the realization settling over him. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice trembling now. "What is this? What do you want from me?" The figure reached into his coat and pulled out a small, silver object, a device, something that looked like a piece of technology the man couldn't place. He held it up for the man to see, his grin widening even further as he did. "This," the figure said, his voice almost a whisper now, "is why you can't run. This is why you never could. It's why they've been watching you all along. They'll always find you." He looked at the father. "And you? You should have known better than to bring him here." The mother's expression faltered, her eyes flicking nervously between the two men. Her lips parted as if she was going to speak, but nothing came out. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken fears and hidden truths that none of them were ready to face. The figure turned his gaze back to the man. "This device," he said slowly, "was the key to everything. It's a tracker, one that's been implanted in you since the day you first left. And it's why you're still on the radar. You're not the first one, and you won't be the last." His smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "But you're the only one who didn't realize it." The man froze, his heart slamming against his chest. His breath caught in his throat. The truth of the figure's words hit him like a punch to the gut. A tracker? They had planted something in him all those years ago. But that didn't make sense. He hadn't done anything to deserve this kind of attention. He had been running, hiding, trying to live a normal life. All he wanted was to forget. The figure took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You think you've been in control, that you've been living a quiet life. But the truth is, you've been a pawn in a much bigger game. And now you're out of time." The man's mind raced. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his quiet, solitary existence, had been a lie. The family, the child, the danger, it was all connected in ways he couldn't fully understand yet. The device. The tracker. The people who had been watching him. He looked at the father, hoping for some explanation, some kind of reassurance. But the father's face was a mask of regret and helplessness. He shook his head slowly. "I didn't know," the father said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know about the tracker. I never should have let you come here." The man turned to the mother, searching her face for any hint of understanding. But she was just as lost as he was, her eyes wide, filled with fear and confusion. The child clung to her side, sensing the growing danger in the room. "We have to go," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave now." "If they're tracking me?" His voice trailed off as the realization hit him. If they were tracking him, they weren't just after him. They were after everyone. The family. The child. Whoever was involved in this game, whoever was behind the tracker, nothing would stop them from coming after those who helped him. But before he could make another move, the door slammed open again, this time with a force that sent the furniture rattling. More figures appeared in the doorway, dark shapes filling the space. The man's blood ran cold as he realized they weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to finish what had been started. The room erupted into chaos. The man barely had time to react before he was grabbed from behind, a sharp, cold hand clasping around his wrist. He struggled, trying to break free, but the grip was unyielding. The figure who had spoken first, his past, watched, an almost bored expression on his face as the chaos unfolded. "This is how it ends," he said, his voice calm, detached. "You had your chance. Now it's too late." The family watched in horror as the man was dragged toward the door, his mind spinning with the sudden realization that the game was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. And with each step, the stakes grew higher. The tracker, the figures at the door, the secrets of the past, none of it was going to be left in the past. The man had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The man struggled against the grip that held him firm, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything that was unfolding. The figures in the doorway were closing in, their steps steady, purposeful. The weight of the past that had come crashing into his life was now threatening to crush him. The tracker, the danger, the secrets, it was all more than he had been prepared for. But as the figures drew nearer, something inside him snapped. He couldn't run anymore. His eyes locked onto the father and mother, who stood frozen in terror, unable to act, unsure of what to do. The child, wide-eyed and scared, clung to the mother's side, sensing the impending doom but unable to understand the full scope of what was happening. The man's pulse pounded in his ears. The family was just as much a part of this as he was. Their lives were intertwined with his in ways they hadn't yet grasped, and no matter how much they wanted to turn away, they couldn't escape the forces that had drawn them together. "Let go of him!" The father finally shouted, his voice shaking with panic, but it was too late. The figures in the doorway were already advancing. The man's eyes flicked back to the first figure, the one from his past. The man who knew everything about him. His mouth went dry as the figure's smile only grew wider, more malicious. This was the moment he had feared for so long. The reckoning. The inevitable return of the people he had spent years running from. "I told you it was too late," the figure said, stepping forward, his hand raised as if to finish the job. "You can't undo what's been done. Not now. Not ever." But before the figure could make another move, the air in the room seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but then, in a split second, a blur of motion shot across the room. The figure's eyes widened in surprise as something struck him from the side, knocking him off balance. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, the silence hanging heavy in the air. And then, like a burst of sunlight breaking through a storm, the man saw her. The mother. She had moved faster than he ever would have imagined, stepping forward with a resolve he had never seen in her before. In her hand she held a small pistol, its barrel aimed squarely at the figure who had been threatening them all along. "Get away from him," she demanded, her voice steady, no trace of the fear that had once paralyzed her. The room seemed to hold its breath as the figure faltered, caught off guard by the sudden shift in power. The man stood frozen for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest, as the tension in the room hit its peak. The figures in the doorway, those who had been watching, waiting, paused, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The father stood behind the mother, his hands raised, as if trying to calm her, but there was no stopping what had just happened. The shift in power was undeniable. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," the first figure growled, his tone still menacing, but now tinged with fear. "You don't know what you've just set in motion. You think this is over? You think it's that simple?" But the mother didn't falter. Her eyes were locked on the figure in front of her, unblinking, her grip on the gun firm. "I don't care what you think. You're not taking him anywhere. And you're not taking my family either." The figure's eyes flickered toward the others in the room, and for the first time, the man saw a hint of hesitation in his expression. It was like a crack in the armor, a small but crucial sign that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as in control as they thought they were. The man's mind raced. How had they known to act now? How had she been able to move so quickly when the odds seemed impossible? The truth hit him like a wave. She had known. The mother had known far more than she had let on. And somehow, she had been the one keeping the family safe all along, playing her part in a game much bigger than anyone had realized. The father had been desperate to protect his family, yes, but it was her strength, her resolve, that had ultimately turned the tide. The man's thoughts flashed back to the device, the tracker, the whispered conversations between the father and mother. The past wasn't just behind him, it was alive, it was watching them, and they had been living in its shadow, whether they had realized it or not. The game wasn't just a set of actions, it was a carefully orchestrated plan. One that he had been a part of all along, even when he thought he was free. The figure snarled, stepping back, his body tense as he glanced at the others in the room. The man could see the internal battle waging within him. This was the moment of reckoning. And for the first time, it felt like the man had the upper hand. "Listen to me," the figure said, his voice low and strained. "You think you're winning. But you're not. They won't stop. No matter what you do, they'll come after you. They'll come after all of you. You think you've taken control of this, but it's already too late. There's no escape." For a long moment, no one moved. The room was filled with a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the shallow breaths of the man and the family. The stakes had never been higher, and yet there was a sense that they had reached a crossroads. They could either walk away from this, leave it all behind, or continue to fight, knowing full well the dangers that lay ahead. The figure's warning echoed in the man's mind. There was no escaping what had been set in motion. But the man wasn't the same person he had been when this all began. He had fought to protect the family, to protect his life, and now he would do whatever it took to keep that promise. With a sudden, decisive movement, the man stepped forward, pulling the gun from the mother's hand before she could react. He pointed it directly at the figure, his voice steady, cold. "I'm done running. You don't get to control us anymore." The figure's face twisted in fury, but he didn't move. The others in the room remained frozen, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding. The man had made his choice. There was no turning back now. Just as the tension reached its peak, the door behind them burst open once more, and this time, it wasn't another figure. It was someone the man had least expected, someone he had never imagined would walk into this moment. The second plot twist was finally revealed. It was a person from his past. Someone who he thought had been lost forever, someone who had been a part of the story all along. And as they stepped into the room, with a look of calm determination, the truth began to unfold in a way no one had seen coming. In that instant, the man understood the final pieces of the puzzle. The stakes had been raised, but the game had only just begun. The figure in the doorway stood with a calm demeanor, as if he had always known this moment was coming. His presence seemed to drain the room of air, and everyone froze, unsure of what to do next. The man's eyes widened as he looked at the new arrival. It was someone he hadn't seen in years, a face he had thought was lost to the past. But here they were, standing in front of him, as if nothing had changed. "Not who you were expecting?" The figure smiled, his tone steady, almost comforting, as though this entire situation was somehow part of the plan all along. The man's heart pounded in his chest as memories from his past began to surface. This person, he knew them well. They had been a part of his life before everything had spiraled out of control. Before the lies, before the hiding, before everything had gone wrong. And now, here they were again, right at the center of it all. The figure stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. The tension was thick, and for a moment, it seemed like time itself had come to a halt. The man wasn't sure what to make of this new development. Had this person been watching him all along? Had they been pulling the strings from behind the scenes? It felt like the world around him was slipping into chaos, and he was just trying to hold on. "You." The man struggled to find his voice. "You've been here the whole time, haven't you?" The figure nodded. "I never left. I was always watching." The words hit the man harder than he had expected. All this time, he thought he had been living in peace, in hiding. He had tried so hard to put the past behind him, but it seemed like it was always there, waiting for him to slip up, waiting for the right moment to come crashing back into his life. The figure turned his attention to the others in the room, the father, the mother, the child. His gaze softened as he looked at the family. It was clear that they had no idea what they were truly dealing with. The mother's hand was still on the gun, but her fingers trembled, unsure of what to do next. The father's eyes were wide with confusion, his face a mask of uncertainty. And the child, small and vulnerable, had no idea what was happening. "You all have no idea what's really going on, do you?" The figure's voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was a sharpness underneath. "You think this is just some random encounter, some twisted accident. But this is years in the making. You're all here for a reason." The father's jaw clenched, and he took a step forward, his voice rising in anger. "What do you want from us? What is this all about?" The figure didn't flinch. He simply stared at the father, as if waiting for him to grasp the weight of the situation. I'm not the one you need to be worried about. Not anymore. The man's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. He looked at the figure, searching for some kind of clue, some shred of understanding that could make sense of all the chaos. You're not in control of this anymore. I won't let you hurt them. The figure's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. You're right. I'm not in control. But there's someone else who is. And they're coming for all of you. You're already in too deep. Before the man could respond, the room seemed to vibrate with an intense energy. It was as if the very air around them had shifted, becoming thicker, heavier. The sound of a low hum filled the space, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The man felt a chill run down his spine as he realized something was happening, something he had no control over. The mother took a step back, pulling the child closer to her. The father, still visibly shaken, looked around the room, searching for any sign of what was about to happen. The figures who had been standing in the doorway had moved aside, creating space for the new arrival to step fully into the room. And then, the truth was revealed. The figure who had been standing there all along, the one who had seemed like a shadow in the background, was not who he appeared to be. The man felt his stomach drop as the figure's appearance began to shift, morphing right in front of his eyes. The figure's face melted away, revealing someone completely different. Someone who he had never expected, but who was far too familiar. It was a person he thought he had lost forever. Someone from his past. The person who had been at the heart of the conflict all along, the one who had orchestrated everything. The one who had pulled the strings. Surprised? The figure asked, his voice now completely different, darker, more menacing. Did you really think you could escape? The man's mind reeled. The person standing before him wasn't just an enemy, this was someone he had trusted, someone he had known intimately. Their betrayal stung like a sharp wound, and the weight of it crashed over him, threatening to drown him in disbelief. You, the man whispered, his voice shaking. How long? The figure laughed softly. How long? Long enough. Long enough to know that you were never really free. Long enough to set this whole thing in motion. Everything the man had believed, everything he had fought for was unraveling in front of his eyes. The family. The tracker. The danger that had been following him. It was all part of a larger plan, a plan he had never even seen coming. But just as the man thought he had reached the bottom, a new voice cut through the tension. A voice that stopped everyone in their tracks. Enough. The room went deathly silent as a new figure entered, this time with an aura of authority and power. The newcomer stood tall, exuding an energy that was both commanding and calming. The man's heart skipped a beat as he recognized them. It was someone he had thought was lost to the past, someone who had always been one step ahead, but who had stayed hidden, watching from afar. I won't let this go any further, the new figure declared, their voice steady and unwavering. They took a step forward, their gaze locking with the traitor's. The traitor sneered. You can't stop this. It's already begun. The newcomer raised a hand, and the tension in the room seemed to dissipate slightly. It's not too late. It doesn't have to go this way. The man watched as the two figures exchanged a tense look, the weight of the years between them palpable. The newcomer's words seemed to cut through the years of manipulation and deceit. For the first time, the man felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. The traitor opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter another word, the newcomer moved swiftly, their hands sweeping through the air. A sudden force seemed to knock the traitor backward, causing him to stumble and fall. Get out, the newcomer commanded, their voice sharp and final. The traitor glared at them but made no move to retaliate. With a snarl, he retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The room was left in stunned silence. The man looked at the newcomer, still trying to process everything that had just happened. What? What just happened? The newcomer smiled, though it was more of a weary expression than a triumphant one. It's over. For now. But even as they spoke, the man could feel that the story was far from finished. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing. There were still things that didn't add up. And there were still enemies out there, waiting in the wings, just biding their time. But for the moment, at least they were safe. The immediate danger had passed. The family was safe. The man could finally breathe again. As the tension began to ebb away, the man turned to the mother and father, who were both looking at him with a mix of gratitude and fear. The child, still clinging to the mother's side, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes, still too young to fully understand what had just transpired. The man's gaze lingered on them, and he felt a deep sense of resolve settle within him. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, he felt like he could face it. The past had come to collect its due, but now, he was ready to fight for the future. For the family he had come to care for. For the life he was determined to build. As the room fell into a tentative silence, the man's thoughts turned to the lessons learned, the truths uncovered, and the choices that had shaped his journey. The past could never be fully erased, but it didn't have to control the future. And with that thought, he made a silent vow to protect those who mattered most, to protect the family that had unexpectedly become his own. The end of this chapter wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something new.